This is episode number 9 with Jesse Miller. He works in technology, but he's a musician first.
Something that is deeply personal, something that is an iceberg where you can chip away at it, but it's essentially bottomless. You're never going to get to the bottom of it, where mastery is a goal, but you'll probably never reach it. Because having that experience of developing over decades and looking back and saying, wow, I really used to know nothing about this. And now I can do something beautiful. It doesn't have to be a physical representation, or it can be something that you're creating beauty. You're making your life or other people's lives a more rich experience. And that it's a continuous process that you will always have. It gave me at times hard times in personal or professionally where I was really struggling or dealing with self-doubt. I always could have I always have the piano, and maybe it's not going to pay for me to have a living, but somebody could say something really negative or hurtful, or I would have a lot of doubt. I had this confidence internally that it essentially nothing really mattered, because I had this thing that was so strong that made me who I am. And I tell people when I meet them, it's like, I'm a technologist. I work in products or sales, but that's not who I am. I'm a musician. And I think that for me, I've been able to define who I am by what I love. And so my career has often kind of followed this path of having a job that gives me the personal flexibility to keep up on what it is music is what matters to me. I just work to make it all work, and to have a family. But yeah, having that thing, find that thing, what it is that it's going to drive you beyond the professional development. I hope that everybody can find that in themselves.
Welcome to Titans of Transition, featuring real-life stories, anecdotes, and inspiration about pivotal career moments from leaders who have been there. Join host Joe Miller, former scientist and senior technology leader turned executive coach, as he unpacks transitional moments to help inspire change.
Hey, Jesse, welcome to Titans of Transition podcast. I'm glad we're finally get together. We got past our technical problems today. Hey, listen, just disclosing everyone else dropping in here. Jesse's my nephew. He's my older brother's son. And as they were consuming the podcast and we were talking, I was reminded, actually I should have remembered, but Jesse's got really interesting transition story to tell himself, and various different angles to it. He's in the technology space, but he's also a musician as well. So without further delay, I'd like to jump in. And Jesse, why don't you tell us about how things got off and running when you were at UC Berkeley and the different things you did there? Sure.
So, my career in technology started a little bit before that with some summer jobs and kind of after school jobs. But, that sort of guided me when I started at Berkeley, always knowing that I wanted to be able to continue that, professional development even while I was taking courses. This worked quite well with my split attention of a lot of different subjects. Kind of struggled to figure out if I wanted to be a computer science student or be a music student, or actually was really interested in philosophy and the mind. Discovered a discipline called cognitive science, which is really great. We could take courses in psychology and philosophy and neuroscience and computer science and linguistics. And so that was a really great way for me to focus my attention on a lot of different areas, still bring up some of the technology side. I struggled actually pretty heavily in the computer science courses at Cal because my brain doesn't work too well in the software development algorithmic nature, but it was still a great way to get involved in that type of thinking. And I also knew that kind of intuitively that I wanted to make sure that I came out of college with a competitive edge. And I also knew that I felt like employers would care a lot more about my experience coming out of college than what my GPA would be or how many years it took me to graduate. So I quickly, after my freshman year, looked for a part-time job at the university to apply to so that I could be building that competitive edge and learning some skills right out of college rather than focusing purely on my coursework.
It's interesting. I just wanted to bring in the other aspect because I'd often get invitations to go see you in concert while you were in Berkeley. I think even in high school. So could you just give us a little bit of flavor of that other side of your brain as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, some people often ask me if I think that, the computer or the math part of my brain is influenced on my music side. And I always feel like they're really separate. To me, the music is just a purely creative, abstract outlet. And maybe there's different types of math thinking and computer science thinking that are more focused with the logic within music. But for me, it was really just this abstract place I could take my mind and sort of have this giant mountain to climb. So I played classical piano. I also played bassoon, both in orchestras in high school as well as in UC Berkeley Orchestra. And I recently just bought a handpan, which is a drum based on the kind of steel drums, which is really fun, more of a rhythmic side. But what I was going to try to say was that I think that having this mountain to climb that I could maybe achieve mastery someday if I lived long enough was something that has been a big part of my own personal development. I had a piano teacher that I started working with when I was in first grade, who actually unfortunately passed away this year. And I remember coming to his house and watching him sit down and play and realizing that, wow, this was somebody who was, almost my parents' age. And he's been working at this for longer than me, and he went to school to do this. If I work at this for decades, maybe I can reach that point. And I know he didn't even necessarily consider himself fully mastered the piano. And I think having something personal to me that I could always turn my head away from academic pursuits or my professional pursuits and really just do something that I owned and I had complete control over and allowed me to get better at, that's always been something that's been a valuable aspect to my being.
It's great to bring out because, it's more often than not, you find that folks that are really deep in technology also have some other sideline. I know a number of musicians. A good friend of mine was CTO of AirTouch Vodafone, and he was a killer lead guitar player. I used to get the chance to play with him some, and maybe I'll have to bring Craig Farrell on at some point. But it's interesting. Little bit of a renaissance nature I find it in folks that are really notable in their careers. So let's keep the story going a little bit further. So you went into that major, but you had a job also at the university as well that I think you moved into your first full-time job after you graduated there as well, didn't you?
Yeah, and I think if I could give one piece of advice based on the experience I had in my initial job working part-time as a student and working part-time, doing a coursework part-time, was, I got that job probably not because I was the best candidate. I wasn't a computer science major. I think I got that job because I was persistent and I was there and I showed up. I handed my resume in person. I waited for the hiring manager to get off a phone call and asked her, can I have an interview right now? And I think that if I look back on it, I don't think that she probably even read the other resumes on the stack. I think I interviewed well enough, and I had enough of a personal connection that I think that they gave me the shot at the job. So that was a big learning point for me, kind of in an initial transition into working with professionals. Until then, I was sort of being treated as, oh, you're just some student. But at that point, that really kind of started a new relationship between me and other people from a professional standpoint. So I worked there for the remainder of my career at UC Berkeley. I worked as a systems administrator, developing a lot of Linux skills, trying to find and make friends with the security admin and the web admin, so that kind of teach me the dark arts of Unix systems administration, so that I could come out of school with some skills that people wouldn't have to feel like, just fresh out of college, doesn't have actual practical skills. So I after that, it was actually an easy transition. Probably the one easy transition that I have was working professionally for the university after my graduation. So I started working as the systems administrator for the neuroscience research labs. This was something that it was right in front of me, and also it was something that meant something to me personally because I'm very interested and motivated by the mind and research in the brain. So I felt really good about being able to support these PhD researchers who were doing all kinds of fMRI and PET and EEG research and making sure that their computational infrastructure was up and running and performant. And so that was a great first step out of the university. But I quickly started to feel like I was maybe getting a little bit stale. I was able to automate probably half of my job so that a year or two in, I wasn't really working full time, but I was making decent money. And this will probably start one of the themes that we'll go throughout this conversation. Trying not to get stuck in the comfort zone, because I definitely had started to get comfortable there and needed to get out.
Yeah, it felt like you were just doing time a little bit then, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what was the next thing that presented itself to take you out of that position and out of UC Berkeley?
Yeah. So I think another maybe theme for these transitions also is it's not purely coming from within, it's coming from outside and listening to people that I respected and having my mentors out there. I think sometimes the word mentor throws people off because you're like, oh, it's somebody who this formal relationship where somebody takes you under their wing. And I don't think it has to be that way. So I had a calculus tutor for about 6 months in high school who I'd sort of lost touch with. And then, after I graduated, had worked a full-time job, he had reached out to me and asked if I wanted to grab a beer sometime. And so, we went and had pizza and beer, and we started talking, he was about 8 years older than I was at the time. And he asked me, what are you doing? What are your plans? I go, I got this great job, working at the university. I've automated half my job. I'm just super comfortable, making good money. And he kind of laughs at me. He's like, oh, that's great, Jesse. But, what are your plans for the future? And, of course, at this point, I'm like 24. I'm not thinking about the future. I'm having a fun time. And, so he says, well, yeah, but, do you want to have a family? I said, yeah, definitely want to have a family. Okay, great. Do you want to live in the Bay Area with your family? I said, yeah, my family's here. My friends are here. Why would I want to leave here? I said, great. There's no way you're going to be able to support a family in the Bay Area with your current profession working for the university. He wasn't denigrating the university position so much as being practical of how expensive it is, the cost of living in the Bay Area. And that was a pretty important moment for me, for someone else who had tried this. He was actually in the process of moving up to Davis, just north of the Bay Area, near Sacramento, because his tutoring company wasn't providing enough income for him to keep his family there. So that was pretty eye-opening, and I think that was the big motivator for me to get off the laurels I was resting on and put myself out into sort of the private sector, which was exciting, but certainly something I probably would have waited more to do had I not had the fortune of having him as a friend.
So what did you do then? From that?
Yeah, so at that point, I just got onto some job listing sites, and I kind of tried to figure out, well, what are the next jobs that I could be as a systems administrator? So I typed in, the skills that I had learned, and a number of jobs came up, and I started to think of myself, well, I don't know if it makes sense for me to just continue the same career as a sysadmin. Maybe I should branch out and challenge myself. I didn't take advantage of the career counseling. I also don't think that the career counseling was necessarily aligned to the line of work that I ended up getting into, which is sort of the pre and post sales parts of an organization, of working as a consultant to install software or install hardware. So in some of the job postings that came up, I saw these jobs like professional services consultant. It's like, must be willing to travel. I'm like, oh, travel, that sounds fun. And work with customers in a sales capacity. I'm like, okay, this is way outside my comfort zone, but it sounds interesting. So I did some more research on this. And so, essentially the top candidate that I found for a job was working as a professional services consultant for a company called SendMail, which was the leader at the time of the kind of enterprise email and messaging space, based on the original open source software that was built at Berkeley. And so that also kind of felt like an interesting fit. Had a sort of a background of we actually used SendMail. I was an administrator at SendMail at the university. So I felt pretty confident in kind of putting myself out for that job posting. And that went really well. I had a great conversation with the hiring manager. Turns out he played the bassoon in high school also. It was just one of these crazy moments where it's like, wow, it's like fun connection. We definitely got to, bring you in for an interview. And, that went pretty smoothly. I think, they were certainly impressed that I'd worked and had Unix skills, as kind of my intuition had guided me, that they weren't going to have to train me on a bunch of basic foundational concepts.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So you moved off into that direction. SendMail was in the Bay Area as well, right?
Yeah, very close. Didn't have to move. I didn't have to get onto a freeway. Just kind of drive down a couple of big streets to get there.
A note for folks that don't live in the Bay Area: not having to get on the freeway is a huge positive thing. I spent hours in the Bay Area. Most people do. Yeah. All right. So
totally.
So SendMail. So how did that turn out?
Yeah, it was awesome. I think one of the great aspects about it was, especially being in a field role where I was traveling, of course I worked internally. I was based in the headquarters, so I got to interact with people who were kind of in my socio-intellectual bubble, IT in the Bay Area is definitely a bubble. But being able to get on an airplane and go off and install messaging infrastructures at large organizations, whether they were banks or power and light companies, other large technology companies, that really opened my eyes culturally, the different ways that people, work and think and have relationships. And so I think that was something I didn't get so much in my college experience. I didn't go and have a year abroad. I didn't go travel in the summers because I was always working in the office. So I really appreciated being able to get experience working with different people. I also really liked the flexible schedule. I mean, they did have to, ship me out to a different city, a couple times a month to go and do a project, but it was very much results driven as a role. And that was a huge, mindset shift for me, is realizing that there are jobs out there where really what people care about is the results you're delivering, rather than just having your butt in a chair all day long. And that really kind of supported my goals of maintaining my music practicing and having a lot of different activities and interests.
Yeah, and the variety of traveling around and meeting the customers and different applications. I think technology is great, and you have to be somewhat self-motivated, especially in a deep technical position, to keep learning. But even that, after a while, I think many people who actually like other people, it's good to get out and about, and I think that provides great context. So how long were you in that position at SendMail, and then let's swing into what came next?
Sure. So I worked as a consultant doing those installs and architecture specs for about a year and a half, and on those field calls, I would often go off with a sales engineer and the account manager. So typically, in enterprise software sales, you've got kind of this triad of the account manager who owns the relationship and all the licensing discussions. Then you have the sales engineer, who is sort of the trusted advisor of making sure that the customer is getting value out of the product. And then you have the solutions consultant, that the sales engineer is promising. And hopefully you have a good relationship there and they're not over-promising what I was able to deliver. And so in this relationship, being at a hotel and went to dinner, I was having a lot of conversations to understand this engineering role. And I mentioned earlier that this was not something that the career counseling office was really set up to coach about. Is nobody ever talked about sales as a career path. That's not like it is documented, and certainly not sales engineering. And I think it's been ultimately one of the most rewarding parts of my career is being a sales engineer. And so having talked to the sales engineer, he really sold me on how great the job was. I mean, I'll admit some of it was money and comfort driven, because he was telling me about how he didn't have to travel as much, and that he was a consultant once and now he's in sales, he gets bigger bonuses. But part of the aspect of it was stressful to be out there replacing, say, like Oracle's email infrastructure. Yeah. It's like you're about to take something down and boot something up, and you've told people there's going to be a couple minutes of downtime, but there's a lot of anxiety there, hoping that when you flick that switch, everything just comes up. Without email, companies can lose millions of dollars every minute. So the idea of still having a similar type of job, but not having that massive stress behind me, I really hope that I did this correctly. was also a really nice, driver for me to the sales engineering role. So I put my card in the hat, and eventually, he left the company, and they picked me to try being a sales engineer, and I loved it. It was certainly something that I had to convince myself that sales was okay. I think that people don't necessarily understand that software sales is different from other types of sales, or just certain types of, they call it complex selling. It's really about building relationships, and if you believe in the product, you're really helping people get what they need. And so you realize that you sell things all the time. You've got friends over and you want to figure out what takeout order you're going to sell them on your idea. And so you're really just trying to make sure that everybody's happy and getting what they want out of the situation. So I worked as a sales engineer at SendMail for another, so it's about a year and a half after being a consultant there.
So that was great experience, hands-on experience. And then I think that, I had done a little sales in my background as well. And I think I really want to echo what you said about getting past the paradigm people sometimes hold about people in sales. That's always the negative stories. I have a few friends who are attorneys, and they tell similar tales about, having to get it past what other people's perceptions are. But actually, and then you brought out the relationship part, and relationship selling is huge because you really want to be able to solve the customer's problem. If you really want to be successful in sales, you can't think about the sale that time, because you want that customer to be a customer for life of you. So that certainly for the company you represent, but also, if you move to a different company, they know they can trust you, that you'll come through for them, and you will tell them the straight story, even steer them away from some options perhaps in order to maintain that long-term relationship. So that's really a valuable experience.
Yeah. And I also say that it was also in that theme of getting out of my comfort zone. While it was nice to not have the anxiety of bringing down a corporate email infrastructure, it was pushing me into a place that I wasn't comfortable, of a lot more public speaking, a lot more social interaction, of high stakes. I think I'm somewhat balanced, but probably lean more towards the introverted side of things, where I get drained after a day of social interactions. Not that I can't do it, but certainly getting up in front of a lot of people and being the expert in the room is not something that I felt comfortable with at all at the beginning. But I certainly throughout college, there were a lot of experiences where I really had decided, from a personal philosophy perspective, just always got to get out of the comfort zone, because that's just really how you're going to grow. So I saw this as a great chance where, wow, this is way outside my comfort zone. I got to go for it.
I mean, that's true. I mean, there's this sense that if you do anything with any risk of failure, you might pull back, but really you can't grow. I mean, you cannot grow unless you get out of your comfort zone, ever. And so, and then I was thinking also with some of your background in music and being in performance, at least in terms of giving talks, maybe it was a little bit different genre, but you still probably could have some level of initial confidence getting up and giving a talk about something you had spent the introvert time in deeply understanding and learning. It'd be different if you were singing it, but you had something to say. And so maybe those things proved to be, those gifts proved to be a good support for you making that transition.
Yeah, I think so. And certainly I think that you mentioned a good one, which is being vulnerable. I think it's hard, but I think being vulnerable gives you opportunities to grow personally and professionally. And certainly anybody who's got a family, kids, it's like, that's the ultimate vulnerability. You leave yourself open to complete vulnerability, and you grow in personal ways that are immeasurable. So I think that, putting yourself in any position where you are now vulnerable is a great way to grow.
Yeah, it's great. Now, I think the next transition we're coming up to is a little different. If I'm not mistaken. So it sounds like you're around 3 years in at SendMail between the two different roles. And I know you had planted the seed earlier in the conversation about, your math professor or your math instructor in high school, and said, do you really want to have a family? What do you want to do? So let's do the next transition here, Jesse. Take it.
Yeah. This was probably, and I think, my note on transitions, I think that they're always the hardest thing. I think it's really great about what you do this podcast is you've focused on something that is so transformational, but also such a difficult thing. I remember, every time I had to write essays in school, the transitions between concepts, it was always the most difficult. You want to focus on that because that really that keeps the story going. So, that said, I think this next transition was probably the most easy and fun one for me to make, sort of a no-brainer, because at this point, as I was getting to the end of what was my SendMail career, my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, Celine, she was in her PhD program at Berkeley and had to go do some research in Paris. So there are microfiche, which are, pictures of, very old magazine or newspaper periodicals that existed in a library and nowhere else. There's in this library in Paris, there's nowhere else where she could find these specific microfiche. So she had to go there for a year. She got funding to go there and study these and be in the library to help for her dissertation. So she's like, okay, I'm going to Paris. Are you coming? And like, what, from a purely relationship perspective, like, how could I say no to that? First of all, it's like, of course I'm going to come. I love you. And I want to continue this relationship. We'd been together for a number of years at that point. So definitely personally motivated, but also there was this other aspect of, I was pretty, I had summer jobs in high school. I worked all through college. I had friends that were going on, fun international semesters abroad, and they'd come home in the summers, like, oh, we're going to go on vacation to so-and-so. You come in? Like, no, I'm working 40 hours a week in the office. So, by the time this opportunity came around, I really needed a break. And, just being burnt out was a big motivator as well. Plus, it happened to be in Paris, which, I was not an internationally traveled person at that point, but I certainly knew about the tales and the draw of Paris. So I had to go. It was amazing opportunity to go. Although I will say it was at the very, height of the recession around 2008, 2009. So I definitely had people in my life, family and friends, who were telling me, like, you're crazy. You're leaving a job in like the middle of the worst recession that you've ever lived through. What are you doing? And like, for me, my answer is like, what am I supposed to do? Like, look at all the reasons I just mentioned here. I have to go.
Yeah. I mean, I do coaching on the side, and this just reminds me of a coaching framework that people often use or in this field. When someone is going through a transition like this, often you ask the person a framing question. Are you thinking about this change as a moving away from or moving towards change? Right. And so a lot of the critics are really thinking about you're moving away from rather than moving towards. And what you just articulated is what you wanted to move towards. Yes, you were leaving the sure thing of your position at SendMail, and you'd done really well there. So you wouldn't want to rock the boat in the middle of the economic turmoil. But you were moving towards your future with Celine. So.
Yeah. I like that.
But you didn't have a position when you left. I mean, you had to leave the company, right? SendMail?
Yeah. I mean, I did a few consulting engagements, in the odd time hours of the day to, I guess, help pay for some of the traveling I was doing out there. But I basically blew through a bunch of my savings, nearly all my savings, out there because I wasn't working for a whole 12 months. And well, it's not super expensive to live in Paris. I certainly wanted to get the most out of it and travel. Every month we chose like a different country to go to for a week or two, because when else am I going to have that opportunity? Yeah. And it was such a critical year for me, for a lot of reasons, just disconnecting from the grind that I had known so well, distancing myself from this. I will say I went towards something, but a lot of the value was actually leaving, getting away from something, because I found that distance from that professional career, the person who I had become, my family, my friends, I had this very strongly rooted identity. I lived in the Bay Area my entire life, never left for longer than like 2 weeks. All my habits, my friends, everything. So it was so rejuvenating to be essentially a nobody. Nobody knew me. Nobody knew how to contact me. I had a cell phone that had like a text message plan. That was it. And it gave me some time to find myself again. Yeah. People ask me, well, how come you didn't take, French classes and learn French? And I said, well, I learned enough to get around and have a good time, but this was my 1 year to focus on who I was, and just getting lost in the streets and figuring out how to get home and just taking pictures. It was really transformative.
Well, that's news to me. I hadn't heard that part of this transition. So it was kind of a reboot for you personally.
It was an absolute reboot. Totally.
Yeah. Were there some, without being too transparent, where you don't want to be, were there some key things that came out of that experience that you decided you wanted to take forward in your future, in your life, that you sort of teased us what things you're leaving behind, but were there some key elements there you might want to surface up?
Yeah, I think I started to recognize how just the concept of expectations and social expectations personally, and how heavy those weigh on us, and realizing that we have control over those. And you know, I remember it took me 3 months to stop getting the phantom vibrate. If anybody's ever not had a cell phone for months, you know what this means. My leg would literally vibrate, and I'd like put my hand to where my phone would be for months.
Like a phantom limb.
Totally. And like I was convinced, and eventually it went away, and it made me realize how deeply rooted the communication, how tightly we've become as a society and social expectations, and realizing that I can be happy without this massive network. Now, I certainly missed my friends and I couldn't wait to get home to them, but there's so much that we have internally to offer ourselves through introspection, or how much, you know, wonderful, you know, subjects and art is out there to discover. So that was a big one for me, was just manage my own personal expectations and people's expectations. So when I would come home, I didn't necessarily want to just fall back into the same place I was. I wanted to come back, maybe making some changes about how I would handle relationships and those social expectations. That was a big one for me. And then the other one I would just say is just learning so much about how people live and what's valuable to them. You know, we all live in our own bubbles. We make them, and they're made for us. And, you know, I think the value of travel, especially internationally, can't really be understated, because you realize that people value such different things. You know, the apartment we lived in was so tiny, and like most people who live in Paris lived in these tiny little apartments. They were huge families, and they were so close to each other. And, you know, from an American who's used to, like, you know, the American dream is like you get your house and you have all this space, and realizing that, well, that can be wonderful, but you don't need it. And so it also changes sort of what your expectations are for what you want out of your life. And of course, I still wanted to come home and get a house, but it just gave me a different perspective on that.
It became more of a real choice, you know, rather than something you drifted into because your whole world is in that paradigm or construct, right? And it must have been Absolutely. A lot of freedom there, and exploring those things that you left behind in the cultural shift, and understanding I really don't need that. I am really quite happy in this 400 square foot studio or whatever it was.
Yeah,
those are great insights. So you were there a year, right?
The fantasy had to end at some point.
Fantasy had to end. So you're going back to Berkeley. So tell us about, so you were going back at that point when you came back home to the Bay Area. Did you have any job prospects, or did you then have to go look?
Yeah, so I'd say about maybe 3 months before I came back, I realized I was going to have to get a job, and I took some, you know, computer-based training and online learning to just keep my memory fresh of all the concepts that I had learned, kind of like security plus type stuff. And I had some thinking about, well, where did I want to end up? I certainly loved pre-sales enough to know that I wanted to go back into a sales engineering role. But if I could choose a type of company, which company, where would it be? And so, you know, I started to think about I knew about enterprise email, and I have a background in systems administration. I don't really know much about information security and cybersecurity. And that always kind of felt mysterious to me and intriguing. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to learn more about that. So that kind of drove me to go and poke around and you know, find companies that I could learn and build my skills up around this area I didn't know and get out of my comfort zone again. So, I had found a couple job postings for Red Hat and RSA and a couple other companies. And, I applied to them, and I'd say about a month or two before I came back, started the interview process remotely. And so I was doing interviews on the phone and over a voice video conferencing. It was like late at night for me and early morning for them. A little awkward. But I think it went really well. And I essentially came back home to the States with nearly an offer. I still had to go do an in-person interview and give a demo and get the kind of more personal connection with RSA. Because that, for me at SendMail, a lot of our customers used RSA for their security products. So I just associated those two, and I felt like that's the holy grail of a company to go and do security for. So I lined myself up for this final interview, the first week or two back, coming back at RSA.
And if I could jump in, just for those that aren't into IT or into technology space, RSA is extremely well known in the security space. Has been for a very long time. So, yeah, that was a big name play.
It was a big play, big name play. And so the interview went really well. I liked the people. They liked me. They gave me a job offer. I had talked about it with my father, and he kind of gave me a kind of concerned warning about that's a big name company. They've been around a long time. They were purchased by EMC, and so they're managed on the East Coast by another larger organization that might not be a great cultural fit for who I was. And so he planted a little seed of doubt in my mind that kind of gave me a little bit of pause. I didn't change my mind, but it gave me enough delay to actually be contacted by a coworker of mine from SendMail who I hadn't spoken to in a couple of years. His name was David Maisling. And David's another kind of pivotal person in my life who gave me some mentoring at SendMail, but also in this conversation, I told him, "What are you doing, Jesse? You back from Paris?" I said, "Yeah, I'm going to go work for RSA." He's like, "Oh no, don't do that." I'm like, "Why not?" He's like, "Well, I worked there 10 years ago. They certainly know security, but you're still young. You got to go join a smaller company that's going to be, better cultural fit. You should come where I'm going. I just joined Splunk." And so this was kind of a key moment where I said, "Oh, well, I remember Splunk." And this is, those of you that don't know on the call, Splunk we started back in the mid 2000s. We're essentially kind of like Google for IT. It's like the easiest way to put it. Essentially, all of the computational and network routing and firewalls and VPNs, all that infrastructure generates data. Some people call it digital exhaust. And the goal is if you can take all of that data, people might call it log files, that's the actual results. Like when you go purchase something on, say, Amazon, there might be 50 different systems that have all looked at that and recorded some little information about it, where you came from, how long it took, so to make sure that the performance is working or the security was done correctly. So you put all that stuff in one place, you can correlate across that, you can analyze it. We call this machining data. Sort of like relational databases, but it's more complicated because it doesn't fit into a nice little box. So that's Splunk. I had known about Splunk. They had come to give a demo to us at SendMail, and we actually integrated their software into our appliances when I was a sales engineer. And this is probably, this is a great story I like to tell because it's hilarious. I didn't buy the Splunk story at all. I was not interested in what they had to offer. I was a sysadmin already. I knew how to find problems.
I got to jump in. I manage a number of sysadmins. And for those of you who might be listening that work for me, I don't mean this in a negative way, but believe me, how many conversations that I had with you where you told me your tools were the best, the ones you developed, right? So anyways, how's that fit, Jesse?
Totally. I knew how to use grep. It's a tool that a sysadmin types and searches for things. I can set up a logging infrastructure. No problem. We did that at Berkeley. We didn't need to buy any software for this. So he kind of laughed at me. He's like, "Yeah, I know. But you got to meet the people here because I think you're really going to love them." And I think that's sort of also an interesting thread is a lot of this was about people. I certainly ended up at places with good technology, but the way that I got there was through the people. So he introduced me to a hiring manager, and I had a good conversation with him. I liked him a lot. It felt like somebody that I would just have a great personal, fun relationship with, in addition to professionally. he convinced me that this manager convinced me that I should come to their technical sales kickoff in San Francisco and meet more of the technical pre-sales team. And that was like a massive eye-opening experience for me, because I was now surrounded by people when I went there where I had that like, I'm not worthy moment, where everybody around me was brilliant. You know, they were funny and disruptive. And the level of intellect that they were speaking at and communicating at and still having a good time, it made me realize that I was far from the smartest person in the room there. I don't want to sound arrogant about being the smartest person in the room. And I'm not trying to say that at RSA in my interview I was, but the gap between these people who were speaking at SendMail and at Splunk and me, that gap was huge. And it gave me this like kind of, I have this competitive drive, and a lot of us do. I wanted to get there. And so having that, it's another mountain for me to climb. And I bit the hook on that. I took the bait purely on the people. I didn't have the vision of who Splunk would become today, massive success over the past 10 years since I joined. I just wanted to go and be around people who I thought I could learn from and have a good time with.
Yeah, and the culture, the culture was such that you were not going to get stopped from doing that. I think established companies, RSA might be an example. I'm not really that close to that technology right now, but if they're from a product cycle, they're on the waning side of the product cycle. Now they try to reinvent themselves. They introduce new products either through acquisition or their own development, but they've been around a long time. And culturally, my experience has been culturally organizations like that tend to be conservative, pulled back and a little bit more entrenched. Was that the case there? I mean, I don't know. I'm just speculating.
At Splunk? Or I mean at RSA? At
RSA.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely the case. People came off as a little bit more reserved. As I've seen it happen at Splunk, being here for 10 years, I've even seen it happen a little bit where a lot of people join the company who are very creative early on because they want to have a lot of control and there's a lot of ability to take risks. I think, like you say, it's natural for a company as they become more established. They can't take the risks because the customers they've grown to acquire rely on them much more heavily.
Right. Cool. So talk about, so I get a sense on why you made that. So you ended up taking a position, obviously, at Splunk.
Took the job. Yeah.
And what was the first role that you took?
Yeah. So I worked again as a pre-sales engineer. And I worked, at this point, I started off on we were called the inside team. So often in sales, you have kind of different stratifications depending on the different accounts or customers you're looking to acquire or support. And so you have often the inside team is working with many smaller customers we kind of consider ourselves hunters, where we're working with, I had hundreds of accounts in my patch. And I worked with 5 or 6 different account managers, and we were on the phone and on WebExes and all the time, or Zoom calls all the time. And our strategic accounts, our brethren over in the other side of sales, they kind of considered themselves, or we consider them farmers, where they had like 1 or 5 accounts total, and maybe they're already customers, and they're just trying to grow the footprint of the Splunk software platform inside those accounts. Whereas over here, we're just trying to land the first deal, kind of greenfield account.
Fun.
So yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I think this is one kind of piece of advice I'd have to any people starting a career in sales or in sales engineering is go do that. Go work on the small side of things and be a hunter first. We've hired, I've worked with as a mentor for some college interns. We hire people right out of college to go directly into sort of the farmer role because we're hiring like crazy. We've got to get people to work. But my advice to all of them is, if you can, try and spend a year or 2 on the like high turnover accounts, because you get exposed to such a broader set of experiences and challenges. Every day it was a different demo. Every day it was a different proof of concept, where people were throwing different questions at me. And it was certainly had to kind of think on my feet and improvise way more. Talk about like getting out of the comfort zone. There were so many opportunities where I was not prepared at all for the questions that were being asked. And, frankly, just like it was hard to manage that sort of schedule. Like all of a sudden, oh crap, I'm supposed to give a demo. I haven't prepared for it. It's just going to happen. Like we all make mistakes, and the more opportunities you have to make a mistake, the more mistakes you'll make, scheduling perspective. So I basically developed this skill set of being able to walk into any kind of room or virtual room and sit down and give a presentation about what we were doing and the value behind Splunk. So I think that, working on these smaller teams where you're going after a lot of different opportunities was a huge part of my development. And I recommend it for everyone out there to get out there and just have that repetition.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that based on the sales experience I had in laboratory automation, I saw a similar kind of thing where when you go into these smaller organizations, as you said, you're greenfielding and growing your market share in that way. You have to be more like an applied mathematician. It's a new problem will be presented to you, and whether or not you make the sales based upon your knowledge of how adaptable the product suite is. And you have to come back and say, you don't have to trust me. I will come back and I will show you how Splunk in this case can meet your need. And whereas on the other side of sales that you were describing, those were more kind of known solution sets, I think. And you're selling into more of an established organization. You're selling into smaller ones that haven't figured out what they even need yet, or there's more flux and change in their technology architecture. So
yeah, and they have totally different challenges. The admin that I talked to in those accounts, he or she might manage 10 different platforms, right? Their attention is so split. They gave me 1 hour, and I wasn't going to get another hour on their calendar. Whereas for the larger accounts, they're setting up meetings with me all the time when I transitioned to those roles. So I had many more opportunities to engage with them. And it's just a totally different relationship outside of the technology of how you're going to get on people's schedules and the types of relationships you have to build. You only have an hour to build a relationship versus you have a year to build a relationship.
Right. Because the people go, typically in larger organizations, they're narrower and deeper,
Yeah.
Specialized. Whereas, as you said, in small organizations, they tend to be generalized. And yeah, that's exciting. So that must have been a lot of fun. I know you've been at Splunk a long time. So how long did you stay in that role, and what kind of transition did you look at next?
Yeah, so I stayed in that role 2 years on the inside, and then I spent a year kind of in a middle role where I was actually out in the field working with not the I wouldn't say the Fortune 1000 or Fortune 100, but maybe like the Fortune 5000 accounts in the Bay Area. So I was out in person, so transitioning on my way to become a strategic sales engineer, because ultimately there's a lot of prestige and potential financial benefit being up at that level. So I wanted to get there at some point, and so I was being more vocal about our product as well internally, and that's one of the benefits of being local to the headquarters. Certainly in these strange times of working from home because of COVID, there's a lot of benefits to having a work from home atmosphere, but I certainly miss being there in the office where the action is, and developing relationships and going meeting and product managers and complaining to them about a certain feature. So I was pretty vocal. So at the headquarters, I got a lot of interaction with the product management organization, and I ended up attending a number of offsite kind of weekend or during the week meetings where they would bring some field employees, from consultants to sales engineers, to go and have these long multiple hour conversations with product managers, which really ended up being product managers presenting a roadmap about future products, and then we would just go try and beat them up for not doing what we wanted them to do. But I was the sort of lone voice for the smaller customers, because a lot of the engineers for the smaller customers, they were based out in Plano. I was the only sales engineer for the inside team in the headquarters. So I was the only person who got to go and represent essentially many thousands of customers that, granted, they were not paying as much money for Splunk as the, say, top 10 high-paying customers. But I complained quite a bit that I felt like we were just making the product go faster and scale larger. This was like my soapbox over multiple meetings. And you never made it easier to install or configure or use. And that was my pain. I was just expressing my pain. It was my customer's pain at that time. Was Splunk was hard to use, and I want to make it easier. We could do far more, efficient work as engineers if you could turn what I do into features. Then you could have me working on more valuable things.
That's really interesting too, because I think that goes back to what you were talking about, the type of individual you were selling into in the larger organizations versus the smaller ones, the deep specialist versus the broad generalist. The broad generalist doesn't have as much time to dig in and overcome the hard to use problem, but it's a huge barrier of entry for the small organizations, not so much for the larger ones. So that's interesting. So how did that pan out? Did there was some changes made in the product suite?
Yeah, so that panned out pretty well. My main argument was I spend all this time installing and configuring Splunk for the customer because I have 2 hours on the line with them, maybe 3 hours. I never get to the point where I am building them value. Yeah, there's some value in bringing the data into one place, but the real value comes from the analysis of that data and presenting that analysis. So my argument was, I want to help build stuff that automates or at least makes the process of bootstrapping Splunk much easier, so that all the sales engineers that, like me, can focus our time on building valuable things. So eventually, I think that either they got tired of hearing my soapbox complaining, or they were convinced at some point, probably both. They gave me a chance to try and kind of put up or shut up, and I was offered a job in product management, which was very exciting and terrifying. I knew nothing about product management at the time. I didn't have an MBA. I'd never worked on a product organization before. And it started off actually as a competitive intelligence lead. The director at the time said that there wasn't an open head count as a product manager, but often the competitive intelligence person is the first person who's going to get to maybe get a shoe in when a role opens up. So I got to learn about our competitors at the time, and then sure enough, like 4 or 5 months later, one of the PMs left, and I got an opportunity to work on exactly what I was complaining about, which was the getting data in. So we call that GDI. It's like, how do we configure all the thousands or hundreds of thousands of devices that have data that need to send to Splunk? Let's make that process easier and make sure the data that comes in is clean and easy to relate to the other parts of the data. So we had a very, very broken interface and workflow. You could literally get lost and stuck in an endless loop in the UI and never get out of it. So I think there was a lot of low-hanging fruit that I was able to point out. And so, yeah, that was a terrifying get out of the comfort zone transition, because not only was I in an area I didn't know a lot about from the process perspective, I certainly knew the product really well. I was now joining a team of people who were relying on someone in my position to guide them. PM is a really weird position. You're the lead, but you're not somebody's manager. And so I didn't have to, I couldn't tell them what to do. I had to convince them what to do. It's kind of like sales.
Yeah. I mean, you're influencing them, and these are typically engineers, right?
Yeah.
And engineers, well, I mean, I don't want to sell engineers short. I mean, they do appreciate the end customer and the needs to a point, but there's also something that drives an engineer, and that's the beauty of the engineering. And so their paradigm is, I want to make something I feel really cool about. I don't care so much about that. I understand, but so it takes a lot of influencing, a lot of sales capability. So it's good that you took that path and did the sales first.
Yeah, I think so. And also I think that what I realize is that how little many people in a product organization know about how what they build is used. I talked to a lot of product managers who didn't really know how our customers use the product. And a lot of the engineers, I think, were similar. And the engineering aspect also, you have a lot of high brain power there. So something that's easy for an engineer might not be so easy for the end customer who's trying to read a manual on it online versus the person who built it. So I was, for example, when I asked an engineer to show me if something worked or not, they would open up a search. It works like there's literally a search bar, kind of like Google is, and you would type in a search to get data back, and Splunk would present this data to you. They would always search for show me data of Splunk's internal systems. We call that like the internal index. None of them ever showed me a feature based on sample data that a customer might have. And that was mind-blowing to me. It's like, wait, you're testing all of your features on like a closed data set that's perfect, that we have refined internally, not real data. Like you take data out of a Cisco firewall and there's 400 different kinds of records that might come back. And it's like a bunch of tangled wires that you have to like untangle versus the data they're showing me. It's all nicely cable tied and all color coded. And so that was a big moment where I realized how important it is, I think, in the products organization to have people who've spent time deeply understanding the pain that the customers go through because they understand the problem. Or in our case, the problem was the data is really messy.
Yeah, that's wild. So, well, there's a lot of deep learning there, and it sounds like I'm not even assuming you got all your suggestions through, but just having some influence in taking the product forward is great. And again, you kind of tipped to the fact that Splunk has been extremely successful. So, I know you're still there. So, and I know you've moved back and forth. So, can you talk about how what was next for you? I mean, did you stay in product a long time, or did you? Yeah.
So I stayed there for about 3 years, and in the past, in this conversation, I've talked about key people in my life who've mentored me or just given that piece of advice that I really needed. And I think that looking back, I was lacking this. This was one regret I have in this part. I didn't have somebody in the product organization that I felt like, and it's probably my fault for not finding them, where I was getting that coaching. And so at kind of towards the end of my 3 years in product management, there were some political situations that I probably could have navigated better to get better outcomes. I had built a feature that made using Splunk much easier, and I was very passionate about it. A whole team, we worked for 2 years nearly on developing a brand new capability from initial prototypes to delivery. And it nearly got scrapped in the end. And it was heartbreaking for myself and everyone on the team. Luckily, it did get released as sort of an add-on, and it's actually this month, hopefully coming back into the product. But realizing I could have navigated that better. And so I wish that I had found that coach. I was maybe too confident to think that I needed it. I wasn't realizing how much selling I needed to be doing to the leadership in the organization. So there was a little bit of, I got burned. Also, we had brought on a new product leader for the whole organization. And I didn't really agree with his vision of where he was going to take the entire organization, not just my group. So there were these two factors. My wife, Celine, was also pregnant with our second child, Kai, at the time. All these things were kind of writing on the wall that made me feel like maybe I should go back to sales for a little while. It's a little easier place. I can go back to working from home, help out, with having a baby, a newborn around. So yeah, after 3 years in product management, I had a great relationship still with the sales team. They were dying to get me back. And essentially I was offered this job to go work with those really large, white whale, big elephant accounts that I wanted to work with.
So something I often hear about when I have these conversations is that, you can have, how do you know when you should make a shift? And so is it something that you sense sort of vaguely internally? Is it something that's thrust upon you? COVID thrust a lot of shifts on people. People lost their jobs, for example, or their job completely changed with all the remote work. But it sounds like this particular transition was a combination of, the second child coming, a new leader, different direction, and then some challenges in terms of things not quite panning out the way you wanted to in your influence, but there was a combination of factors here. They all came together. At a certain point in time, you just sort of had an aha moment and said, okay. Right?
I did. Yeah.
That's the way I read that. They pulled Joe back to the good guys at sales.
They pulled me back. And I still miss that role. I just want to really quickly say that product management is an incredible opportunity to be creative, working with user experience designers. You're sort of in the middle of user experience and the design mind and the engineering practical mind of what's actually possible, trying to manage that. I love that creative process. So while I was excited to come back to sales, I was also sad to leave something that I loved, and I miss it still. So I came back into sales, which I very comfortable. Maybe a bit more of going back into a comfort zone than my previous transitions. But it was now working for really, really large customers, which is a type of relationship I hadn't really worked with. So I was working, my initial customers were like Chevron and McKesson, Google, like very large names, some of which we had existing strong relationships with, some of which never answered our phone calls. And, working with smaller sets of accounts, I was also working with only 1 or 2 account managers. So that was one of the things I really love about sales, is there were just a relationship to develop, this teamwork and camaraderie. People aren't competitive. You just all want to be winning together and driving the bottom line. So I was really excited to be kind of back in this really strong competitive team. Like, we are competing together as a whole organization and, trying to close really big deals. So I really enjoyed working as a sales engineer for about 2.5 years. I got the benefit to work on our largest deal we've ever closed, which is really exciting. And I also, right around that time, I had the opportunity to be a candidate for what we call our principal program, which is a principal position. Typically in technology is sort of the highest or near highest position you can get to. And at Splunk, our principal organization really had a high standard where you had to develop a project. You needed a mentor and you needed to get people above you to sponsor you. You had to come up with a project you had to execute on in 3 months to essentially prove that by yourself, you could build something transformational to the company. It's essentially a director role that isn't an actual management position.
Top of the tech.
And so that was a big transitional thing for me personally. It's like, wow, in the midst of a huge sort of account work I'm doing, I have to also manage this really large project to prove my worth.
Well, that's kind of wild. And on the sales side, you were like the technical hired gun in the field to help close the sale, along with the account managers. Is that the role you were?
Yeah. In some cases, it was accounts that I had been working with for some time. In other cases, if an engineer on my team or a adjacent team changed roles or left the company, they would look to me, because I had the kind of veteran tenure there and a reputation, to come in, and it's like, we lost our SE, we need you to come in and bring this one home. So it was really fun. I got to be a hero, and it was great.
Now, you still doing that, or have you moved again within Splunk?
So I moved again. I don't know if I can't make up my mind, or I just like to move around. And I mentioned the principal program sort of as a segue to that, because my mentor for that project, to help me make sure I was being supported by the organization to succeed, he was working on a project called the Voice of the Customer, which is a way to have a better interlock between our field organization, our customers, and our product organization. This is mainly driven by a challenge we've had at Splunk of having so many enhancement requests to the product that customers will come up with ideas all the time. And sometimes we call them like the pizza and beer ideas, and they're just like over pizza and beer, they come up with crazy ideas, but our support organization has to take them in. We had over 10,000 of these. As a product manager, my first time, I inherited a list of about 1,000 enhancement requests for the search features. And it was like huge panic attacks. Like, what am I supposed to do with 1,000 features requests? You just kind of let them sit and you freak out and pretend they don't exist.
It's a bit overwhelming.
It's a really hard problem.
You have to go through them all to make sure that they're not just for people who don't understand how to get that. They just aren't as familiar with the product and must be all over the map.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of raw data to go through.
You can't get through them all, because you're expected to deliver on stuff. And that's the problem is we weren't going through all of them. So customers were being frustrated. They felt like we were sort of a black hole. And so at the time,
at that issue then?
Yeah, exactly. So my mentor at the time, Jeff Champagne, he had come to me and he liked the work that I did on my project and said, I'm trying to build a solution to this problem. It's an enhancement request platform that essentially it is more sort of democratic in nature, where people can vote on an idea and those can get bubbled up. So he asked me if I was interested in going back to product management with him, and into a new organization within what we call field product management. And I knew this problem very well because I freaked out about it, having 1,000 ideas dropped in my lap. And so it felt like a great way for me to move back into a place that I loved, and to have a bigger impact. I felt like at this point, I've been at Splunk for, this was like 8 years. Now I'm in my 9th year. I want to make really big impacts. I have a strong connection to this company, and closing big deals is a big impact. Adding new features is a big impact, but being able to influence the entire roadmap of all of our products in a way that is representing the customer, that goes back to my initial soapbox moment of like, you're not doing enough to help the smaller customers. I don't only care about them, but making it more an equitable representation of people's ideas. I felt very strongly about this.
It has come full circle in that way. And
totally.
And in this space that you're in right now, it's really, there's huge leverage, right? So you might not see the fruit of it right away, but it has huge leverage. I mean, you can make a big impact even in a large company. Close sale, that's a lot of revenue. That's certainly a lot of, but it's sort of a step function that tends to maintain. But by influencing the product roadmap, you really, there's a compounding effect there.
Yeah. And actually the chief products officer asked me, like, why do you want to do this? Why not just go back to be a feature PM? I told him, honestly, the feature PM work creatively is more fun, but I feel really strongly about having a big impact and representing those customer voices. So we actually launched Splunk Ideas. That's the platform that I own. I direct Splunk Ideas. We launched that in February. We since then have completed over 46 features coming from customer ideas. People have submitted over 1,600 ideas, and we've got over 36,000 votes to the platform in a pretty short period of time.
Nice. So you basically created a platform that takes care of all that raw noise and puts structure around it, puts market testing around it to see how many other voices want the same feature. So then you can, that's nice. That's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a product manager, sales teams are often coming to you and saying, my customer needs these 10 things, they're blocking my deal.
Yeah.
And, everybody's pain is legitimate, but there's only so many blockers that, features that you can build. And you're doing all this context switching, but I'm trying to build something, now I'm being harassed by a salesperson, and I can't, it's not efficient. It's, as the company grows, that does not scale. Small companies, potentially. So I felt like I was also, I was helping customers because I was feeling like they're actually getting a voice and setting expectations. There is an actual defined process with documentation that says we have a voting process. We split votes into cohorts. It's very analytical to try and prevent people from gaming the system. We try and use financial information and competitive information all the time. So people appreciate having a known system instead of throwing an idea into a box and hoping for the best. And the product managers appreciate being able to not have to manage all these, one-off lists of people's top ideas. I give them 5 ideas a month that we consider the top ranked ideas from an algorithm that we wrote. And that's what they can still build other things, but so I'm super excited about probably getting too deep to it because it's my life right now. But I think it's a wonderful place for me to have ended up. I'm not quite sure where I'll end up next, but the last thing I'll say about it is it felt like it was opening another door for some reason. I'm not just intellectually and interested in solving this problem. This is something that I think that a lot of companies must struggle with. And I don't think that there's a really well-defined solution out there. And so I sort of see this as, maybe this is something I'll want to continue doing at Splunk or other places. But regardless, it opens this new door or pathway for me to explore that is just there for me. And so I think that's another thing that I think we all should be doing in our lives is when you see a door, you don't have to go run down as far as you can through that hallway, but you should at least open it so that it's there should you want to come back to it at some point.
Yeah. I was just thinking there are some sort of planted breadcrumbs here through our conversation that I've learned more about you and how you see a problem or you see something that isn't quite the way it should be, and it's like a rock in your shoe. You might not address it right away, but you're going to get back to it. But that's a key element. Not everybody's wired that way, Jesse. I mean, but that's a key part of who you are. You know, if you weren't even in the technology field, I'm convinced just from this conversation that you wouldn't settle for things status quo for very long. You would be trying to move, influence, and move things forward. So that's a key element that would inform a potential transition that would work for you, I would think.
That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I've known that about myself, but I don't think I've explicitly thought about using parts about who I am to drive future transition points when I come to them.
We tend to minimize those things. And you know, before we talked about when you went to Paris and what you left behind and the whole reboot process, and how you discovered that there were certain things you thought were needs really weren't needs. In a similar way, our paradigms and our perceptions about things can be constrained by our thinking about our jobs and what our job is, right? So our job is, you know, I'm an SA or I'm a product manager or something like that. And there's already a stack of things in those rules, those paradigm attributes that take up most of the space in our thinking. But often the biggest impact doesn't come from those things. It comes from those kinds of minimized things, like, I'm not going to stand for this being the way it is. I had a conversation with a guy who's founder of a biotech company in Berkeley that I worked at for 11 years, Pat Scannon, and he had this phrase where he said he got interested in going, and people could check it out. I think it's episode number 3, but he got this interested in diving over in Palau and finding remains of World War II vets who were lost. And once he got this interest, he had this phrase. He said, I just couldn't put it down. Mm-hmm. You know, even leading and founding another company, he was taking month-long, 6-week-long trips to Palau every year. So in a similar way, there's an element inside of all of us, I think, that is really our gifting that can be applied in different areas, right? But certainly for you, you innovate around a problem and you're not going to let go of it. And so once you get that change made, you're probably going to perceive something else needs to be changed.
I really appreciate the positive description of what I've often thought about as just pure stubbornness in myself. Because there's certainly a lot of opportunities where I could have given up on problems because it was 4 a.m. or I was so frustrated. But yeah, I am that sort of person where I can't give up on things. And I will mention one influence in my past. I played a lot of video games as a kid.
Yeah.
I don't have time for them anymore, but I think that was a big influence on me being stubborn and just not giving up on things, because I hated to lose. And I like, if I gave up, I saw that as me personally losing at something. And so whether it's an analytical problem or it's an issue with the product, I'm not going to forget about it. I'm going to go find that person and jab at him every time I have, and eventually get a chance to do it myself. I have to at least try.
That's great. Well, I think we need to bring it into a close here. So what I typically ask in these sessions is, you know, what advice would you give to your 25-year-old self or someone starting out? You've dropped a few things over the course of the conversation. So does anything come back to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly will reiterate the comfort zone mentality is get out of that, break the comfort zone. I had a mantra with my friends. It was probably too vulgar to repeat about the comfort zone, but you just got to kick it to the curb. Nothing really great happens out of resting on your laurels. Great things happen when you push yourself, and you have to push it. That is a transition. So I think it's a wonderful, your podcast is a wonderful platform for this, because I think it fits into something I think is important. Is you're going to have to bite the bullet and eat that bitter pill of a transition to get out of that comfort zone. But that's going to bring you that vulnerability. You're going to grow from that personally, which ultimately, you know, we want to focus on our careers, but don't forget this is all about personal development. Like, who are we becoming? We're always becoming somebody. We're not just this one static rock. It's like we're rivers through time. We're always changing.
Nice.
Where are you going to change a river? Where are you going to end up? And so I think that the comfort zone's a big one. The other one would be finding and leveraging mentors. It doesn't have to be someone who's a teacher. It can just be a friend, somebody who's it doesn't have to be older than you. It can be someone who has experiences that you can leverage. Ask people about their experiences, bounce your ideas off of them. The times where I did that, I was grateful that I did. And the time that I didn't, I regret, is one of the few times in my career I really regret having not done something or maybe done something different.
Those are great. Those are great. Now, we also had another pearl earlier, and that was music. So,
and yes, thank you for reminding me.
A lot of time diving deeply into technology, and I get jazzed about this, but
yeah.
What part does music have in your life, and has it been part of the stream that you've got as you've gone through these transitions? I've got to hear you play. Been blessed by that. So
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think if I could hope for one thing for everybody in this world, is that they would have something, whatever music is to me. To me, music, it could be art, it could be anything, but something that is deeply personal, something that is an iceberg where you can chip away at it, but it's essentially bottomless. You're never going to get to the bottom of it, where mastery is a goal, but you'll probably never reach it. Because having that experience of developing over decades and looking back and saying, wow, I really used to know nothing about this. And now I can do something beautiful. It doesn't have to be a physical representation, or it can be something that you're creating beauty. You're making your life or other people's lives a more rich experience. And that it's a continuous process that you will always have. It gave me at times, hard times in personal or professionally, where I was really struggling or dealing with self-doubt. I always could have I always have the piano, and maybe it's not going to pay for me to have a living, but somebody could say something really negative or hurtful, or I would have a lot of doubt. I had this confidence internally that it essentially nothing really mattered, because I had this thing that was so strong that made me who I am. And I tell people when I meet them, it's like, I'm a technologist. I work in products or sales, but that's not who I am. I'm a musician. And I think that for me, I've been able to define who I am by what I love. And so my career has often kind of followed this path of having a job that gives me the personal flexibility to keep up on what it is music is what matters to me. I just work to make it all work, and to have a family. But yeah, having that thing, find that thing, what it is that it's going to drive you beyond the professional development. I hope that everybody can find that in themselves.
Well, that's great. It's beautiful. I think the other thing too is it besides giving you balance, and even though you have this drive to innovate and you get passionate and you love learning, you're in the technology space, you refill by getting away from it. And I think one of the experiences, I have nowhere near the mastery as you, and I'm in guitar, but you refill, and getting away from that I think it makes you better on the other side of your life as well, and comes into play in ways that are hard to quantitate, but not only just getting energy back, but also giving you other perspectives. And I think you talked about neuroscience. I'm convinced that there's other things that happen when you get over there and use that part of your brain that music really lights up. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it with perspective. It's all about as many perspectives as possible. Travel gave me some perspective. Music gives it time away from things. Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, listen, Jesse, it's really been a pleasure having you on the podcast. I feel like your Unc has gotten to know you a little bit better. And once again, I appreciate it. I will, in the show notes, Jesse may have some contact information he's willing to share if anyone wants to follow up here a little bit more. And once again, thanks everyone for joining us on Titans of Transition with Jesse Miller.
Thank you, Jeff.
You bet. Hey, thanks for joining me today on Titans of Transition. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please check the show notes for additional information. Also, please like and subscribe to this channel.